Hi guys! Please like and subscribe my channel. Thank you for watching. Imagine walking into a city of shining marble, where aqueducts carry fresh water over miles of countryside, fountains bubble in public squares, and crowded markets hum with merchants selling wine, olive oil, silks, and spices. The air is alive with voices speaking Latin, the chatter of children, the clamor of craftsmen. This was the glory of the Roman world. But now imagine the same place just a few centuries later. The aqueduct is cracked and dry. The once proud streets are silent, covered in weeds. A goat grazes where senators once debated. Windows gape open like hollow eyes. Buildings crumble into ruin. And the wind whistles through deserted arches. What happened to these cities? The centers of one of the most powerful civilizations in history. Why were they abandoned in the Middle Ages, left to rot while the world turned away? The story begins with the fall of the Western Roman Empire in the 5th century. For centuries, Roman rule had provided stability, order, and infrastructure. Taxes funded armies. Engineers kept aqueducts flowing, and roads connected the empire's farthest reaches. But when Rome collapsed under the weight of barbarian invasions, corruption, and economic exhaustion, everything that kept the cities alive began to unravel. The very things that had once made urban life possible, security, trade, and engineering, suddenly disappeared. Invasions tore apart the old urban centers. When the Visigoths sacked Rome in 410, it sent shockwaves across the empire. Vandals swept into North Africa, cutting off the grain supply that had fed millions. Huns thundered across the plains, and later Ostrogoths, Lombards, and Franks carved up the remains of Roman provinces. The cities, which had once seemed indestructible, became targets. Wealth was stored in them. So raiders struck again and again. Inhabitants who survived saw their cities burn, and decided life in the countryside was far safer. That decision changed everything. Instead of crowded city streets, people found themselves living on scattered farmland. Villages sprang up around fortified manors, and lords became the new protectors. The early seeds of feudalism took root. Life moved inward toward the safety of castles and fields. In a dangerous, unstable world, the countryside was where survival was possible. Cities, for all their monuments, suddenly became liabilities, easy prey for invaders and death traps for anyone trapped inside their walls. The infrastructure that had once made city life comfortable also began to crumble. Roman aqueducts were marvels of engineering, but without skilled maintenance, they cracked, clogged, and collapsed. Sewers overflowed. Roads crumbled into mud tracks. Flooding and waste piled up in city streets. Water that had once been abundant became scarce. For ordinary people, it was easy to dig a well in a village than to rely on a broken aqueduct in a decaying town. The economy, once the lifeblood of Roman cities, withered too. Rome's strength had always come from long-distance trade, the movement of goods across the Mediterranean. But with pirates at sea and bandits on the roads, merchants could no longer risk traveling. Spices, silks, and grain shipments disappeared. Without markets, cities lost their purpose. Jobs dried up. Shops shuttered. Urban populations drifted away. Each family deciding that farming a small plot of land offered more security than waiting for the next famine or raid in a vulnerable city. Fear magnified this abandonment. To live in a city during the early Middle Ages meant constant danger. Walls were breached repeatedly. Raiders slaughtered populations or enslaved them. In Britain, when Roman legions withdrew, towns like Londinium withered. Instead, small hamlets grew nearby, safer, less visible, and easy to defend. Across Gaul, Spain, and Italy, the pattern was the same. Cities that had been thriving centers of culture became hollow shells. Religion played its role too. Christianity had grown under Roman rule, and as the empire collapsed, it reshaped Europe. Temples that once filled city skylines fell silent. Pagan monuments were abandoned or dismantled, their stones carried away to build churches and monasteries. Christians often saw Roman ruins as reminders of a corrupt, pagan world. True power, they believed, lay not in marble palaces, but in the quiet devotion of monasteries and abbeys. Many of these were built in rural areas, away from the old urban centers. Knowledge, art, and faith migrated into the countryside. Slowly, monasteries replaced cities, as the beating heart of European life. For those left behind in the ruins, daily life was grim. Imagine walking through cracked marble streets where grass pushed between the stones. Statues, once gleaming, stood chipped and weathered, their faces eroded by rain. Wild animals roamed empty marketplaces. Roofs collapsed, leaving homes open to sky. In some cities, small pockets of people clung to survival, scavenging stone from abandoned theaters and forums to build huts or repair churches. But for the most part, these once great urban landscapes became ghost towns. By the 6th and 7th centuries, only a handful of cities maintained real populations. Rome itself, once a city of over 1 million, shrank perhaps 20,000, many living in ruins. Constantinople survived in the east, but in Western Europe, the urban age had ended. Villages and castles dominated the landscape, while the Roman dream of bustling urban centers faded into memory. The silence of abandoned Roman cities became part of medieval imagination. Stories grew around the ruins. Peasants whispered that they were haunted by spirits or cursed by the gods. Some believed giants had built them, because no ordinary man could carve such massive stones. The awe inspired by these ruins shows just how complete the break was between the world of Rome and the world of the Middle Ages. Yet the collapse wasn't the end of cities forever. Slowly, new centers would rise, built not on Roman power but on medieval trade, pilgrimages, and faith. For centuries, though, Europe lived in the shadow of empty marble streets, reminders of a lost civilization. The question remains, if cities died so completely in the early Middle Ages, what brought them back to life? How did Europe move from ghost towns and abandoned amphitheaters to the bustling medieval cities of Paris, Florence, and Venice? The answer lies in the second part of the story, when trade, religion, and ambition revived urban life and breathed new energy into the ruins of the Roman world. When the old Roman cities lay broken and silent, many believed urban life had ended forever. For centuries, Europe seemed destined to remain a world of villages, castles, and farms. Yet slowly, almost invisibly at first, the seeds of new life began to sprout. The ruins of marble temples and forums became the foundations for a very different kind of city, one shaped not by Roman emperors but by medieval merchants, pilgrims, and kings. The story of how cities returned is just as dramatic as the tale of their fall, and it reveals how fragile human civilization truly is, and how resilience can bring it back from near extinction. In the early Middle Ages, life was still overwhelmingly rural. People worked the land, owed labor to their lords, and lived under the watchful eyes of castles. The city, as the Romans had known it, was a memory, but a few places survived. Rome itself, though a shadow of its former glory, clung to existence because it remained the heart of Christianity. Pilgrims traveled to pray at the tombs of martyrs. Bishops established their seats in crumbling cities like Cologne or Trier. Around cathedrals, life began to gather again. Even in decay, these sacred places drew the faithful, and with them came inns, craftsmen, and markets. The church played a key role in this rebirth. Monasteries, though often rural, preserved knowledge and wealth. Cathedrals, when constructed, became magnets for people. Pilgrimages created streams of travelers moving across Europe. Roads that had once carried Roman legions now carried pilgrims heading to Santiago de Compostela in Spain, Canterbury in England, and, of course, Rome itself. Every stop along these routes needed markets, food, and lodging. Small towns swelled into bustling centers of activity, simply by serving the constant flow of the faithful. But it was not only religion that revived urban life. By the 11th century, trade began to stir once more. Europe's population was growing, harvests improved, and people wanted more than just bread and wool. Merchants braved the seas and reopened long-distance trade. Markets that had been empty since Rome's collapse came alive again. A shoemaker could sell to more than his neighbors. A blacksmith could find customers beyond his village. Slowly, marketplaces grew permanent, with stalls and shops forming the seeds of new cities. The Crusades gave this transformation a dramatic push. When armies of knights and pilgrims set out for the Holy Land, they reopened connections with the East. Spices, silks, and luxuries flooded back into Europe. Italian port cities like Venice, Pisa, and Genoa grew rich supplying crusaders and trading with Byzantium and the Islamic world. These cities became symbols of a new kind of power, not based on emperors or legions, but on ships, merchants, and coins. The medieval city was reborn not in marble splendor, but in narrow wooden streets and noisy markets. Yet its energy rivaled that of ancient Rome. The contrast between ancient and medieval cities was striking. Roman cities had wide stone avenues, aqueducts, and grand forums. Medieval towns were crowded, often filthy, with wooden houses leaning over narrow alleys. Fires broke out easily, and disease spread quickly, yet they pulsed with life. Guilds of craftsmen, associations of merchants, and councils of burghers ran their affairs. Bells rang from cathedrals, markets overflowed with chatter, and students gathered in universities that sprang up in Bologna, Paris, and Oxford. The ruins of Roman buildings were sometimes stripped for stone, sometimes reused, and sometimes simply left as ghostly reminders of a past age. The Colosseum itself became a quarry for new churches and palaces, its stones scattered through medieval Rome. Legends grew around these ruins. Peasants, seeing the massive arches and crumbling walls, believed they must have been built by giants or even supernatural beings. The scale of Roman engineering was so far beyond their own that it inspired awe and superstition. Abandoned aqueducts were called bridges of the devil. The empty forum seemed haunted. In this way, the ruins shaped medieval imagination, becoming symbols of a fallen world that still loomed over their own. Specific examples tell the story of this transformation clearly. Londinium, once a thriving Roman city, was abandoned after Rome's withdrawal from Britain. For centuries, it lay silent. But by the 10th century, a new settlement grew nearby, eventually becoming London. In Germany, Cologne and Trier had once been Roman strongholds, though they shrank in the Dark Ages. Bishops rebuilt their strength and transformed them into key medieval cities. Rome itself dwindled to a fraction of its population, but pilgrimages and papal power kept it alive until the Renaissance revived it further. Each of these cities followed the same cycle: collapse, silence, and rebirth. The reason medieval cities emerged so slowly was simple. They required safety, trade, and stability. Without these, urban life could not exist. For centuries after Rome's fall, none of these conditions were secure. Invasions, famines, and wars kept Europe fractured. But as stability returned under stronger kings, as fields produced more food, and as merchants reopened their routes, cities became not only possible but necessary. By the High Middle Ages, they were thriving once more. The reborn cities of the Middle Ages were different from Rome, but they carried echoes of it. City walls rose again, echoing Roman fortifications. Roads connected markets just as Roman roads once had. Rulers styled themselves as inheritors of Rome. Charlemagne crowned as emperor in the year 800, and later the Holy Roman Emperors who tried to revive the grandeur of antiquity. Even in their poverty compared to the old empire, medieval people looked back to Rome with a mix of awe and longing. By the 12th and 13th centuries, cities like Paris, Venice, and Florence had grown into powers in their own right. Paris was a center of learning and kingship. Venice built a trading empire across the Mediterranean. Florence flourished with banking and art. These were not copies of Rome, but they showed that urban life had returned in force. The weeds that had once overtaken abandoned forums gave way to new marketplaces filled with life. Church bells replaced the voices of senators, and guild halls replaced marble forums. But the pulse of the city beat once more. And yet, even as they thrived, medieval cities lived in the shadow of Rome. Writers, scholars, and rulers never forgot the ruins that surrounded them. They imagined themselves as successors to a fallen giant. They told stories of emperors and gladiators, even as they walked streets that were narrower, dirtier, and more chaotic. Rome remained both a warning and an inspiration. The idea that even the mightiest city could collapse haunted them. The idea that greatness could rise again gave them hope. The return of cities in the Middle Ages teaches a sobering lesson. Civilization is never guaranteed. The same Europe that once boasted aqueducts and amphitheaters had sunk into centuries of rural silence, only to climb back toward urban life again. It reminds us that cities are fragile, dependent on trade, safety, and the choices of those who live in them. When those vanish, cities can die. When they return, cities can flourish again. The story comes full circle. Those silent marble streets that had once been abandoned were not abandoned forever. Life crept back, markets grew, and new voices filled the air.